Let's come to History 11. And just to clear this up, this is not clearing up because I tripped on asphalt and have bruised myself. We're trying to continue to experience a dynamic which is called history, and that this dynamic is a hypersonic flow. It is hypersonic because it is not only fast and complex, but that it has more dimensions than experience has in nature. When we began a year and 3/4 ago to experience this learning, we found that nature was better characterized as a flow rather than as things. And we started our whole experience of learning by taking a pair of timeless qualities. We took a person, we took Henry David Thoreau, and we took a cosmological background. We took the I Ching. And so we brought Thoreau as one of the first great conscious naturalists and brought him into a pair with one of the earliest surviving cosmologies in the world, the I Ching, which goes back to about 3000 BC, makes it 5,000 years old. And we took Thoreau as an individual and found that by positioning him in various relations with the I Ching, that we were able to experience for ourselves a sense of paired wonder, and that this pairing then prepared us for a procedure that we have followed ever since. That we will take pairs of people, or because books have been the constituent of learning now for many thousands of years, pairs of books, preferably pairs of books by pairs of people who are of great interest still. And by rotating these pairs, we get the same effect as you would get by having a tuning fork. And that by having a series of these tuning forks, we would eventually be able to tune ourselves as an instrument. Just like a piano tuner will take a set of tuning forks and will tune a piano, and eventually one will be able then to play that piano in tune. And what we're doing is we're taking a long set of pairs of people, of books, to help us go through several stages of tuning. And we saw that nature is definitely more than a stage, it's like a phase. And so we took a cue from that nature is a dynamic phase, a flow, and that what comes that dynamic phase, what emerges into existence, are the things of this universe, including ourselves. And everything that exists emerges out of nature in a very similar way. It doesn't emerge and just stay there, stay put, but it emerges in an iterative, vibrational way. So that the universe is actually a shimmering, vibratory quality. And we have seen this in our own century just past, that the atom is not just some little marble, infinitesimally small thing, but is an orbiting system. It has angular momentum, it has radioactivity, it has isotope qualities, so that even on the atomic structure, all elements are vibratorily calibrated in such a way that they do two things. They absorb energy and they emit energy. And so we took a cue from that there is an absorptive integral quality, and there's also a radiant differential quality. And so with the pairs of people and the pairs of things and the tuning, we took the integral and the differential as a very large, the largest tuning of our whole learning. And we saw that in order to explore the absorptive integral, we would have to go through an ecology of nature. And in order to explore the differential conscious, we would have to go to a second ecology. And that second ecology had something to do with a higher order than just the natural integral. It had to do with what in ancient times was called by all people supernatural or magic. We used a term which has been in use now for about 600 years in English. It came into use in Chaucer's time. Instead of calling it magic, instead of calling it supernatural, which are misleading terms, we call it initially vision. That vision is related to nature in a complementarity. And just as nature allows for an integral to come into existence and vibrantly be alive there, that vision in its differential way allows for another kind of iteration to come into being and be there. And that while material things, existential things come out of nature, what comes out of vision are spiritual forms. Spiritual forms like works of art, spiritual forms like the spiritual person, and that these forms, instead of having a vibratory integral structure, they have a vibratory differential structure, and the difference is the difference between something which has a focus as a point and something which has a lensing quality that shows the full rainbow, the full array. So that differential forms like the person or works of art show us the array of possibilities, and that array of possibilities has a resonant index to it, just like existential things have an integral index to them, which is not discoverable right away in experience, because experience has to acquaint itself with the world. And as it does, experience discovers that it's not an existential form, but it is a second process that is healthy when it flows with nature. And we call this process by the classic name, myth. That the mythic flow of experience is where images occur, where language occurs, where feelings occur, and that this flow is healthy or tuned when it flows with nature, when it participates with nature, so that all human populations everywhere have considered themselves real when they are able to participate in their lives in a natural way, that their lives fit into nature. And that in between these two flows, existential things in their vibratory, iterative relationality really have objectivity, because it relates the two flows of nature and mythic experience in such a way that they're able to not just unite, but they flow together as one. So that the sense of oneness with nature and experience is a confirmation that what has taken place objectively in between holds them together. And that holding together is the way in which existential rituals operate and work. Rituals have as their purpose a limited set of actions whose purpose is to make an objectivity in the world that allows for nature and experience to flow as one, to be together. And just as nature and myth have this flowing quality, existentials in ritual have their second quality as well, and that's the development of the mind. And the mind uses symbols as its objectivity, and when the symbols in the mind correlate with the things of the world in such a way that the experience between them is able to flow and be one with nature, then we say that the ecology is full, it's complete. And that this four-phase ecology is like the four seasons. It's completely natural. It's like the four directions. It's completely coordinatable. One can locate and one can identify, one can participate in and have security in this. It has become apparent that for as long as, even before our species, there were moments of extraordinariness. The species of beings that came just before us were Homo Neanderthals, and not at all the crippled cavemen of the 19th century stereotype. But Homo Neanderthal was very successful for many hundreds of thousands of years. And one of the sites of early Neanderthals was on a mountain that is in what is today Israel. And the mountain was Mount Carmel. And the excavation of the Neanderthal burial on the top of Mount Carmel showed that it was almost 200,000 years old. And one of the qualities that was in this burial site is that surrounding the skeleton of the Homo Neanderthal, he was about 5'8" and not at all deformed, but surrounding him were the ancient remains of seeds of flowers, so that the body had been outlined by flowers 200,000 years ago within sight of the Mediterranean harbor of Haifa down below. So that even before our species came, the experience was that somehow life, when it gets to our kind of complexity, has experiences which exceed nature, which exceed ordinary experience, so that one has an extraordinary happening, and that this extraordinary happening is not like a puncture of nature, but it is like an opening that allows something else to come into play. That there is a magical dimension that comes into play. There is a visionary dimension that comes into play, and when it does, it begins to change the way in which the symbols in the mind work. The symbols in the mind have always looked towards the world, and look toward the world to unite it and to keep it in its ecology. But now it's like a fifth dimension, a quintessential dimension comes into play, that the symbols in the mind begin to have the tendency to not only look out at the world, but to begin to be able to have a reflective quality of looking at an inner world that's beginning to develop its own space. And that eventually this space becomes the space of consciousness. And that as consciousness gains in its spatial quality, it also, because it is a complement to nature, as it gains space, it also gains a different quality of time from nature. And this is why consciousness, when it reaches a certain maturity of space, its sense of time matures, and instead of just being able to look back, it is able to look into the future. It is able to foresee as well as to reflect back. And this sense of having two senses of time is the beginnings of the seeds that will become history. When human beings become extraordinarily used to an expanded space, our species has always shown people who have this capacity as having these kinds of thought bubbles. They're holy, they're special, they're sacred. or a cross-section of a thought bubble would be a halo. And these blessed people are people who live now in a 5-dimensional continuum, which is visionary consciousness that nature accepts. And she accepts in such a way that she relinquishes her place in that ecology to visionary consciousness. Not that she leaves, but she lets the attentiveness go towards existence and experience and symbols, but instead of having nature in that frame of reference, now visionary consciousness is there and works in such a way that it transforms. Now you have a different style of human beings. You have a style of human beings who learn that their experience can relate with each other in terms of nature, but that there's also a second possibility of relating to other people in terms of visionary consciousness. And out of this comes a different quality then. The quality that the physical existential body is not the only form which we can be. That we can also be a transcendent spirit form of person, which is also shareable among human beings, among people. And not only among human beings and people, but animals can develop this sense as well. There are, in our time, many people who have developed the ability to have psychic pets. And anyone who has lived in the wild for any time at all understands that not only animals, but that the vegetation. When I was a young man, about 19, I became the head porter for Sequoia National Park in the Sierra Nevada, and I learned that the sequoia trees, 4,000 or 5,000 years old, could be friends, and in deep meditation, in deep samadhis, could feel the brotherhood of the forest. And then when I read Thoreau or John Muir, I understood exactly what they were talking about. And I remember reading in the mountains of California, John Muir one time was in Yosemite, and he had climbed down Half Dome quite far and was trying to understand the lay of the valley. And then he realized it was getting very late in the afternoon. And so he started to climb back up, and he reports that he got to a point to where the sun was going down faster than he could move, and also that he realized that he was running out of physical energy, that he didn't have the strength to get back up to safety. And so he had a moment where he was making his peace that he was going to have to fall. And he said a grace came over him, and without any effort whatsoever, he simply walked back up to the top of Half Dome, where he gave thanks that the valley had welcomed him and had saved his life, and that the earth itself can be a friend. This is the extraordinary quality of the art of living, not just the myths of experience, not just the myths of culture, but the art that can be that of a broader, more mysterious quality of life. And out of that mysterious quality of life comes the deeper flow of history, which is like vision. It flows like vision, but flows on a more conscious level, on a higher level. And out of the flow of history comes a different quality. Out of experience, out of the mythic experience, comes culture. But out of the flow of history, conscious history, comes civilization. So that all of a sudden, several thousand years ago, almost everywhere on the planet was something that one of our figures, we're taking Hannah Arendt and Hegel. 200 years separate the two of them, and in between the two of them, the genius of European philosophic culture blossomed, and especially in terms of history. But one of Hannah Arendt's teachers, his name Karl Jaspers, he lived to be a very old man, and Their letters to each other over a lifetime are somewhere about 800 pages. Jaspers, in one of his books on history, said, there was a time when every civilization on the planet had a sudden conscious revolution, and he called that the Axial period of civilization. That about 500 BC, suddenly you had everywhere. You had Lao Tzu in China, you had the Buddha in India, you had Pythagoras in Egypt and Greece, and everywhere that you look, there were not just revolutionary individuals, but they were bringing into play something that was conscious, that the ecology of nature has a complete complementarity in the ecology of consciousness, and therefore, if nature has 4 phases, consciousness must have 4 also. And that those 2 4s, that pair of 4s, will make an 8. Will make a figure 8, and that if you put a figure 8, in ancient Egypt it was the royal cobra that made the figure 8, and then if you had a lot of these figure 8s together, you had this accordion of figure 8s, and that was the image of living time. And living time was not time in nature, but it was a living time in eternity. And if you took one of the symbols of the figure 8 and laid it on its side, then you had the infinity sign. And this would be the simple way to write eternity as infinity. And very quickly in the axial period, you found Lao Tzu or the Buddha or Pythagoras understanding that one could go back to the most ancient conscious events in their civilization, and there was like a threshold wave front at the very same time, about 3000 BC. And that this was a very curious thing, because from their perspective, 2,500 years ago, they would have looked back 2,500 years from their time and found that there was a creative threshold there again. And so in our time, we looked back to them as an axial period, just as they would have looked back to an axial period before them. And one of the persons who figured the cycle out later on was Plato. And Plato found that if you take the 12 signs of the zodiac, which follow the sun's path through the stars, that you come to a great cycle of the heavens of about 26,000 years. And that this is the great year, not just of the earth vis-a-vis the sun, but of the stars themselves and the sun vis-a-vis the stars. So that as the earth makes a year going around the sun makes some great year of about 26,000 years of moving in the stars. In our own time, here in Los Angeles, upon Mount Wilson, when it was one of the greatest observatories in the world, Edwin Hubble was the one who discovered that there are more galaxies in the universe than there are stars in our galaxy. And found that our galaxy itself, the Milky Way, is a great spiral that turns, and it is so massive, it takes so long to turn that it has only turned 9 times since it was first emergent out of the primordial ether and dust and gas and dynamics of the cosmic nature. That the Milky Way has turned just 9 times since it was first condensed and made. And so we live in a time where we're understanding that there are many layers and levels. There are little atomic star systems. There are living hormonal systems on the molecular and cellular level There are great years in a season of the earth. There are great years in the season of a star, of the season of a galaxy. And we know now in the last 15 or 20 years that galactic populations are not just random, but that they collect themselves in great, huge surfaces as if they were like bubbles. And that in the inner part of these bubbles, some 400 million light years, you will find very few galaxies, and then all of a sudden they will be in this great sheath. When it was first found about 20 years ago, the first indication was that there was a great wall of galaxies about 500 million light years away, and then they realized it isn't a wall, but it's part of this great curvature. What we're looking at here in our learning is a way to bring the four phases of nature and the four phases of consciousness into a complementarity so that they fit. And they fit not just in an integral way, but they fit in a differential way as well. And that the differential is an emitting vibratory that has for its index not a structure in the mind symbolically, but it has the infinite array of all the energies brought into not just a single form, but like a jewel-like, infinite faceted form. And the word Pythagoras used for this was cosmos. That the cosmos complements the universe, and that together they make something real. And just so, in a human being, when one learns the complete cycle, the complete ecology of how to be natural, of how to have your existence, of how to be cultural and have the traditions, and then of how to be symbolic so that thought has clear focuses, there is still the transform to go through the second ecology, the inner part, the inner world, or an other part, a transcendent world. But that transcendent world is not one of existence, but it's one of possibility. And so a great change comes about when the lens of the person in the art of their being able to be differentially conscious as well as natural, the flow of historical energy actually comes out almost like a seven-dimensional flow. And it has so many possibilities of possibilities that its very nature is of an irreducible complexity. And what comes out of this is a sense not of a culture that is traditionally binding because it makes sense to everyone in just this way, but that a civilization is an indefinite number of cultures, each one able to relate in a whole variety increasingly. And one of the earliest ways in which this was described, a person between Hannah Arendt and Hegel, was the great American philosopher William James. James, who wrote the world's first textbook on psychology in 1890, still in print, 2 volumes, very large. After he wrote it, he realized that what was needed was not a psychology so much, but the way to have a varietal philosophy. And so he wrote Varieties of Religious Experience. There are not only many varieties of religious experience, but there are varieties that are coming into play all the time. And he followed it up by one of the most underrated series of lectures and books in world history. It's called A Pluralistic Universe. And he was, in fact, giving a version of the pluralistic universe at Stanford in 1910, just before he died, when he stopped in the midst of talking about the varieties of variety in human experience. And he stopped himself, and the old William James, with his beard, his dignity, and he said, men will have peace when they work as hard for peace as they do for war. We will have what we work for. And so it is up to us not to distrust our efficacy of work and our shareability of effort and our communicability of our essential sharedness, but we must put it into play, put it into endeavor. And out of this, one of the few people to reference that was Albert Camus, and he wrote a little pamphlet in the midst of the Second World War called Neither Victims Nor Executioners, that human beings must stop killing each other for whatever reasons, and whatever reasons gives the indication. People do not kill each other because they do not understand each other, but because they do, and their response is they're outsiders. They're against us, they're enemy. And one of the earliest figures, Hegel, in his philosophy, developing into philosophy on world history, is one of the earliest figures to bring the gorgeousness of the interplay of the Enlightenment and the great Romantic Revolution, that when he was young, he was efflorescent as an individual. With a couple of his friends, we talked about this last week, the great poet Hölderlin and the great young philosophic genius, even at 15, Schelling. And Hegel was convinced, instead of being a pastor to a little church in some little German town, that he was going to be a new kind of world pastor to a new kind of humanity, which had been ushered in by the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And all of this led him increasingly to try to deepen his ability to take a visionary consciousness that had a very special critical capacity, and to keep looking again and again at the mind, at experience, at the world of the relationship between them. And increasingly in doing so, it was as if the energies of life in Hegel evaporated from him. And he became more and more abstract, and his physiology became more and more that of a ghost. As he rose throughout his career of being a bigger and bigger lecturer and writer, more and more famous, he eventually became the big professor at the new university in Berlin. And at the same time, those people who saw him said that he looked as white as if he were a phantom, that he was not really there. And he would pass through the streets without even noticing people or anything else. And this intellectual giant phantom left a heritage of books that reform the whole basis of the way in which philosophy and politics and social comment came into play. And one of the biggest critical figures against him was Hannah Arendt. She came to understand there is something insidious at play, not because he was a bad man, not because he planned bad ideas, but that something had happened in the play of the man's life and development, and we must know what kinds of processes are happening that we don't know, that we're unable, evidently, to be reflectively knowing about, that there's something in our very, not the constitution of our nature, but the way in which our nature transforms into consciousness, the way in which the mind becomes conscious. There's something in that transition which is precarious, which is perilous. And while it can do great good by giving you foresight, it can also have a negative quality where instead of having a foresight, one uses those powers to look back and not foresee anything except the inculcation of the doctrines that you consider the strongest integral, the index that applies to the most people at the most time, and one enters into a tyranny of empire that feeds itself on constant war. In Hannah Arendt, when she was a young philosophic student, she was 18, she was Jewish, she went to the University of Marburg, and she had one of the most powerful and famous philosophers of the 20th century as her philosophy teacher, Martin Heidegger. She fell in love with him, even though he was 33, he was married, he was the big professor, and they had a love affair for about 4 years. In that love affair, she found that there were qualities that scared her in Martin Heidegger. So she left and went to the University of Heidelberg and began studying under Karl Jaspers. And as she did, she took her experience of Heidegger with her, and she wrote her first thesis on love and St. Augustine, on the founder of the theology of the Roman Empire that became the Christian theology of medieval Europe, scholastic Europe. The love in here is not love like an amour. The Latin word is caritas. It means the love between people. It means the relationality, the neighbors, the friends, the community, and that somehow in Augustine there were the personal qualities that he had. His Confessions have been read for 1,500 years. It's one of the great personal transformations in the planet. And yet, Augustine's personal transformation became codified more and more until one will read the Confessions as something of interesting from a human being, and when you come to the City of God, his great, huge work, you find that it is the ideology of an empire that will survive even the fall of the Roman Empire. How can this be? And then the big shock of her life, a couple of years later, the Nazis took over Germany, and Martin Heidegger became the philosophic spokesperson for the Nazis. She and her husband fled to Paris, and when they were in Paris, they were seized as undesirable aliens and not sent back to a concentration camp, but were kept for several years until finally she got to New York City in 1941 with her husband and dedicated the rest of her life to trying to solve what is it not just with men, what is it not just with people of the 19th century or the 20th century or the 5th century, what is going on here with human beings that the mind can self-deceive to the extent that it becomes tyrannical and becomes not just a killer, but the most irrational of all possible worlds, becomes a mass murderer of humanity. How can this be? And one of the things that Jaspers brought out again and again, that Hannah Arendt learned from him, we must understand that the differential projection of openness cannot be reduced down so that it is an inverse funnel, that it means that more and more people have to be eliminated because they're a jeopardy to the ideology that we have. It is a quality in Jaspers where he says, the ever-present readiness to loss of faith is today fostered by spiritual movement as such, by misunderstood science, by misunderstanding of the part of the masses. Half knowledge leads to unbelief. And so what we need is a full knowledge. But the full knowledge is only half fulfilled by the symbolic mind and its integral. The other half of that knowledge is its openness to possibilities. where the binary is not 1 and 0, but the binary is 0 and infinity. And that in between, the 0 and 1 and the 0 and infinity is a transformation that all human beings like ourselves need to make. It is the ability to encompass more than what we originally understood. In other words, we have to learn how to learn. We have to envision vision. And what gets in the way is that when history comes into play, the whole mythic tradition of experience subsides naturally out of the focus. And the panic is that we have lost not only nature, but we have lost our world. And out of this comes a reflex from the failure of the energies of history to go back and tighten tradition, to tighten by ideology the symbolic hold on existence, so that we don't get into this peril of losing our world as we have lost nature. This indeed is a fall. Not a mythic fall, but the failure of history. Let's take a break and we'll come back. Thank you. Let's come back to our motion. And our motion is that we are flying in a hypersonic dynamis called history. And the reason that we are flying in this is that for several thousand years now, our kind of beings have generated this out of the prisms of their transcendental development. That when any one comes to transform, their visionary capacity is not just fleeting and momentary, but it receives resonant context and support by all of those who have gone before us. And so at this stage of the early 21st century, we are surrounded by millions of micro layers of previous consciousness that adds up to this enormous thrust of history. One image to have of this is almost like a supernova of hyperconsciousness that we are carried along by, and if we, as we are able, learn to fly with it, it's like a tailwind, it'll help us. But if we decide somehow that we would like to stop this up, it's like trying to stop up the flood. And in the 20th century, more than any other century on the planet, there were attempts to corral this historical energy into ideological funnels and frameworks. And what resulted out of this was that not only were they smashed, but hundreds of millions of people were smashed in the meantime. Here, early in the 21st century, there is a move to make a new world order. And that new world order is trying somehow to be clever about a new way to make funneling. But it is going to amount to the same thing. What this learning is how to develop a kaleidoscopic consciousness, your vision in an open array, and it takes its cue from two great physicists who transformed the world about 65 years ago, 70 years ago. Niels Bohr and Robert Oppenheimer. One of Oppenheimer's little tiny books, he wrote 3 little tiny books, and one of them is called The Open Mind. The other figure, Niels Bohr, was famous because he's the one that went to President Roosevelt in the late 1930s with a specific recommendation that there needed to be an open world, that the advent of the control of nuclear energy, of atomic power, made it incumbent on world leaders that only an open world would be able to survive. It was about 30 years later that Bertrand Russell, in one of his great speeches in London in the 1960s, reminded everyone, Lord Russell at the time was 90-some years old. He looked like a big gawky bird, and he said, "Man has never made a weapon that he has not used, that sooner or later they will be used." One of the qualities that we're seeing in Hannah Arendt was her acquaintance from the beginnings of her enormous personal intellectual development with two of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, Heidegger and Jaspers, and her own genius that came out increasingly, and her own experience, and her own realization that what is nightmarish about this is not that wars happen, it's not that men make better weapons and will use them, but the nightmarish aspect is that they will be forced under compulsion to use them, not just to kill a few people, but for mass murder beyond belief. It is conceivable that several billion people will die if we do not transform the world. But the world cannot be transformed by just planting trees, or just by thinking nice thoughts, or adopting a tree. The transform comes because the perilous transform of the mind into consciousness has a peculiarity that the mind in its nature cannot observe. It's invisible to it, because it does not register at all. And so the mind skips over it as if it were a hiatus, as if it were nothing. One of the biggest attempts in the 1940s, in the Second World War, by a philosophic genius to try to come to terms with this. He was an editor of the French underground newspaper Combat with Albert Camus. His name is Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre wrote a huge philosophic work that everyone was reading in the 40s and 50s called Being and Nothingness. Being and nothingness. And in his genius, he came to a point in Being and Nothingness where he found exactly the place where his existential anxiety began. And he called that chapter The Whole. And Sartre said that man is courageous, he's existentially practical, but when it comes to the center of the mind, what is experienced there is nothingness, as if it were a hole in the mind. And in the panic to fill that hole, he reaches out to grab anything that he can on any level so that he will not disappear into that nothingness. And that as he does so, because nothing works, his anxiety level keeps rising, and his spread to try to find something that will work increases exponentially, and he becomes ravenous. To not experience something deeper than the anxiety, which is dread. And that the dread, the existential nausea of being faced that at one's center is nothing, a black hole that will not allow anything to escape it, an oblivion. One of the most powerful things about Karl Jasper's work, that he was not a philosopher initially, but he was a psychotherapist. It was a special kind of psychotherapist, is what was later called existential psychotherapy. And he wrote the textbook on it back before the time of the First World War. He was already one of the founders of taking William James' psychology and deepening it in an existential application. Jasper's two great philosophic forebears were Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard, a Dane, whose great works have titles like Fear and Trembling, or The Concept of Dread. Kierkegaard, who was so intensely lonely and anxious and existentially grilled that one reads his books, and as you go on, you find that every paragraph becomes more and more refined, every sentence more and more refined, every word is nuanced so it is precise and exact, and more you get the sense that Kierkegaard is an absolute genius, but somebody who only walked on razor edges. That there is no way that you cannot be sliced by following this path of razor-sharp refinement. On the other hand, Nietzsche took exactly the other existential thing, that more and more he quit being philosophically exact and he became philosophically exuberant. Larger and larger. We can't just have refinement on edges, we need more and more openness. And increasingly, Nietzsche's books are fields of effervescent joy that one has to demand openness. And one of his last works, before from an infection with advanced syphilis, he was put into an insane asylum. One of his last great works is Thus Spake Zarathustra. That there is only existential salvation in complete explosive openness, the joy of not being trapped ever by anything or anyone, including oneself. And that the number one hunter of us are not other people, but is our own mind that seeks to cringe from such a vast openness and seeks to cut it off at the source, to not let us see that there are possibilities, to not let us see that there is infinite openness, to keep us within the confines of the mind and the comfortable culture and the little rituals that we know what we're doing and what other people are doing, and that somehow this sets in a revulsion because the thing that one hates most is the only thing that will save you from this explosive oblivion. Jaspers put Kierkegaard and Nietzsche together in a kind of a X-shape. One existential therapist who was a Jungian early on and then became an existential therapist, Maynard Boss, used a diagram one time. He said, as long as people have this kind of crosshairs that's straight up and down, they manage in the world, but when it tips one way or the other, they get an X, and the unknown of the world inundates them. And this is the cause of neuroses. And if you begin to see that this is not an illusion, but actually has happened to you, is happening to you, and other people is actually happening, that the neurosis matures and becomes a psychosis, because one now believes that it is true. It isn't just an illusion, It isn't just a delusion, but it is horrific because it is true. And that human beings can communicate this to each other. And that they then, as a population, under neurotic stresses, under titanic anxiety, verging on the psychotic, will do anything to not let this happen, including having a kind of a tyranny like the Third Reich. And so these persons that we're taking give us a 200-year parenthesis within which it went from the joyous breaking of the old molds of the American and French Revolution and many other revolutions around that time, the Romantic rebellion, that man has a heroic nature by stepping out. That in between that and the concentration camps of the Third Reich is a very peculiar 200 years in which it looks more and more in hindsight as if experience had become so condensed that the horizon of mythic experience in the culture became more and more squeezed into the point to where it was no longer possible to distinguish one's individuality from the masses. And in one of his earliest critiques of all this, Man in the Modern Age, Karl Jaspers, when Hannah Arendt was a young student with him, working on her St. Augustine thesis, which he got published for her, he says the peculiarities of the masses, this is in a section called The Limits of the Life Order, and the subsection is called Mass Rule. The peculiarities of the masses as the fleeting unity of a mob or crowd have been ably analyzed by Gustave Le Bon. His book is called The Crowd. It's been in print ever since it was published, about 100 years ago. Analyzed as impulsiveness, suggestibility, intolerance, and mutability. It's always changing. The public, quote, the public is a phantom. The phantom of an opinion supposed to exist in a vast number of persons who have no effective interrelation. And though the opinion is not effectively present ever in the units, such an opinion is spoken of as public opinion, quotation marks. A fiction which is appealed to by individuals and by groups as supporting their special views. The masses support us. It is impalpable, illusory, transient. 'Tis here, 'tis there, 'tis gone. A nullity which can nevertheless, for a moment, endow the multitude with power to uplift or destroy. And so a social impulsive compulsiveness began to come into play more and more about 200 years ago, and about 100 years ago reached the point at which it began to catch fire. So that the social situation, not just in Europe, but round the entire planet, began to have what apparently was the beginnings of another axial period. And that previous axial period of 2,500 years ago, and the one previous to it 5,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago is the beginning of civilization in China, Fuxi, the founder of the I Ching. The beginning of civilization in Egypt, the first dynasty, Narmer. The beginnings of Vedic civilization in Egypt. The beginnings of what led to, in Sumeria, the Sumerian cities and city-states. That everywhere, about 3,000 BC, one found an axial period, and then 2,500 years ago, another one. Lao Tzu, the Buddha, Pythagoras, everywhere one looks, and that apparently now is another axial period where every single aspect of ourselves is transforming, not transforming into something, but transforming out of everything. And so one has the most peculiar kind of a vertigo. That if you're trying to stay where people were, in some culture, in some tradition, it keeps evaporating faster and faster. So that one is left, the phrase translates out of the German as groundlessness, without ground, and shows itself as having no traction. That it doesn't matter what you do, your rituals no longer have the traction that they used to have. And one can confirm by speaking with people who have lived, say, several generations longer, yes, things used to work. They do not now work. And one finds in the axial period, you find qualities where the ancient ways no longer seem to work. And so there had to be new sages to bring a new quality of civilization into play. The difference between Fuxi and Lao Tzu, that difference in 2,500 years, is an enormous span of time as far as it is between us and Lao Tzu. But when you come to the Tao Te Ching and you see its relationship to the development of the I Ching all the way through China, one understands that there is something indelibly different about the Tao Te Ching from the I Ching. And that is this. In the I Ching, it is always the ability for the centers of paradness to exchange places and to continue to work. The way in which the I Ching puts it is 3 lines. The broken line is on the bottom of the first trigram. It's in the middle of the second. It's at the top in the third. It is the broken line in the middle that is able to change places with the 2 broken lines and the unbroken line. In the bottom, it moves then to the middle and then to the top. It's on the inner part of those 2 columns that the exchange is, and that's fire and water. They're the 2 natural solvents in nature. Fire and water will dissolve almost everything. But in an organic chemistry, what is a solution very often is not fire and water, but alcohol. The alcohols are made generally from diet. They come into being not from just alcohol, but from sugars. Sugars found the chemistry of alcohols in metabolism, and it makes a third quality of dissolve. And what that dissolve does is it allows the exchange of the 3 lines that are unbroken and the 3 lines that are broken. They also now can exchange. So not only do the centers exchange as in nature, but a third transform comes into play so that the entirety of heaven and earth can exchange. And one gets here a new kind of complementarity. The complementarity of the exchange of centers leads to a new life. When a male and a female exchange centers, one has a child. But when heaven and earth exchange, they do not exchange centers, but they exchange allnesses. And what is delivered there is not a new thing, not a new person, not a new existence, but a completely new realm. A new heaven and a new earth is the way it used to be talked about classically. And so an axial period, whenever it occurs, has this ability for the protean nature of people to personally be able to take their individuality and make it transparent. And when you have a transparent mind, the open mind, you're able to let experience flow through the open mind into visionary consciousness without any interruption whatsoever. And so there's a continuity, but the flow doesn't go the same way. Because differentials work in not an opposite way, but they work in a complementary way. So that what happens is that instead of experience flowing through the open mind, it flows in the open mind and is met by differential consciousness flowing the other way, so that they interpenetrate where the openness of the mind is, so that transparent symbols have a different quality. They have a 5-dimensional, not a 4-dimensional, a 5-dimensional creativeness. And where the mind has imagination that helps unify, creative imagination helps create. And that's why creative imagination, when it delivers forms, it delivers creative forms like art, like the spiritual person. The spiritual person is not natural, but is supernatural, is created just now for the first time. And not just the first time, but each iteration is original. And so one has what in axial periods is always called the true man or the true woman, the true person. They are fresh at every iteration, billions of times a second, and so they are eternally renewed. That nothingness has no place for them other than just simply an occurrence of intervaling. It's just the space in between iterations. It's just the way in which the energy frequency will rise and fall, rise and fall, rise and fall, and one will get this sine wave of the energy, but the median of the energy would be a line that disappears into nothing, and yet, though it is real, it doesn't occur in an obliterative way. It simply is interpenetrated both ways all the time, and so the nothingness opens and acts as openness and not as emptiness. It acts as freedom rather than oblivion. And so in each axial period, like we are facing here in the early 21st century, it only takes someone to remind us of this ancient wisdom. It doesn't have to be manufactured, but that the reminder requires for there to be a new way to experience from nature all the way through the transforms into the cosmos. And it's this combing all the way through that produces the healing. It isn't something that one does or takes, but it is going through that infinity, that double process that is the healer. It doesn't restore back to anything. It creates freshly exactly what is real and eternal. By the time of Hannah Arendt studying with Jaspers and realizing that her relationship with Heidegger was both fortuitous and perilous, Jaspers came out with a great classic, a 3-volume book on philosophy. This is a translation from University of Chicago Press, about 1969. I remember when it first came out. He pointed out again and again in all of his works, increasingly, that the culprit in the works is the closed mind. It is the closed mind which has a taste for the specific comprehensiveness of doctrines that will handle everything, and this is called an ideology. And in one of his late great books, this is called The Origin and Goal of History. Jaspers, published by Yale, and printed here in 1965, originally 1953. The following are some typical manifestations of this dissolution of faith. Thinking in ideologies, An ideology is a complex of ideas or notions which represents itself to the thinker as an absolute truth for the interpretation of the world and his situation within it. It leads the thinker to accomplish an act of self-deception for the purpose of justification, obfuscation, evasion, and in some sense or other to his own advantage. Hence, the apprehension of a way of thinking as ideology means the unveiling of error and the unmasking of evil. Bestowal of the epithet ideology upon a way of thinking is to reproach it with untruth and untruthfulness, and therefore constitutes the most violent attack. The difficulty is that the mind will choose self-deception over oblivion. And when it is compelled to oblivion, it will compel deception and figure out a way to rationalize it. This is the nightmare. That it isn't just that there are bad people, but that there are evil conditions that cannot be abrogated without a transform across the board. It's like a life becomes a game, and the only way to not play the game, because any way you play it, is death. The only way to not play that game is to get out of the game, out of the gamesmanship. Don't put your attention on the game, on the board. Transform your attention increasingly so that it includes more and more of the differential realms. And the threshold of success in that is art. It is the phase of art, and we're taking our learning not by subjects, because subjects are already pre-digested by ideologies that have been here for thousands of years. Those standard subjects were made at the last axial period. Aristotle and those people already made these subjects. They have not changed. They have become poisonous, radioactive. Not that the subjects are bad, but that by creating learning in categories of subjects, the only protagonist who can move with those subjects is a subjectiveness that finally is referential back to the closed mind. Because the closed mind itself will conceive of itself in such a way that its projected ego will seem to it the perfect fulcrum, the operative center. And if it can convince many people that they are better off by doing this, you then have this mass movement by an ideology. And the only way they can cement it is to make sure that everyone conforms in their ritual existent basis. Otherwise, it's going to fall apart. And those who don't will have to suffer the consequences. One of the most poignant books ever written on it was by a San Francisco longshoreman who became a philosopher. His name was Eric Hoffer. I interviewed him in San Francisco a couple of times and did a paper on Hoffer. One of his great books is called The True Believer. And he says the fanatic is everywhere on the march. But the worst thing is not that he will die for his cause, but he will convince you to die for his cause. This is the fanatic. What we're looking at is increasingly how we have become funneled and hemmed in by a rejection of historical consciousness, by an opaquing of the symbolic mind so that the visionary consciousness doesn't happen, so that the artistic spirit person doesn't become a lens for infinite possibilities. But instead, all of this is closed off at what is supposed to be the root. But the mind discovers that its sense of identity is only as strong as its correlation with the world, with existentials, with rituals. And so the only way it can not be cut off at the root is to make sure that the rituals are enforced exactly as prescribed. And if anyone does it differently, they're jeopardizing the entire game. More next week.